My aunt tore the check in half before I could reach across the table to stop her. Not slowly, not with hesitation. With the specific, deliberate violence of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity and had decided this was it, both hands gripping the paper, the sharp sound of it splitting, her eyes on mine the entire time. The room went silent. My grandmother's lawyer, a 63-year-old man named Preston Harwell, who had practiced estate law for 38 years, and who had clearly seen things in those 38 years that had not prepared him for this specific moment, set down his pen and looked at the two pieces of paper now lying on my grandmother's dining room table. My cousin Marcus reached forward and tore each half into quarters. His mother, my Aunt Vivian, stacked the 8 pieces in a neat pile the way she arranged everything in her life, with the performance of order over the reality of chaos, and pushed them toward me across the table. She said, "There, problem solved." What she did not know, what none of them knew, because they had been so focused on the destruction that they had not been paying attention to what Preston Harwell was doing with his briefcase, was that the check she had just torn into 8 pieces was a copy. The original was in an envelope that Preston had already sealed and addressed. The original was already on its way to the bank, and the phone call that was going to ruin their lives was approximately 72 hours away. Let me take you back. Because a check for $5 million and the people who tore it up do not exist in a vacuum, and the context is the whole story. My name is Celeste Oduya Warren. I am 36 years old. I am a licensed pharmacist and the owner of 2 independent pharmacy locations in Charlotte, North Carolina, that I purchased at 28 with a combination of savings, a small business loan, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had been told by 3 separate people in her first professional year that independent pharmacy ownership was a dying model and that she should aim lower. The pharmacies are doing well. The stubbornness was the correct response. I am also the granddaughter of Miriam Oduya, who turned 81 in February, who was born in Lagos, and came to the United States at 26 with her husband and $17 in combined savings, and who had spent the intervening 55 years building a real estate portfolio in Charlotte that was, by the time of the events I am about to describe, valued at approximately $11 million. My grandmother built this. Not inherited, not received, not advantaged into. Built. She and my grandfather, who died in 2009 from a stroke that arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, had purchased their first property, a 3-unit rental building in East Charlotte, in 1978. The building needed significant work. They did the work themselves on weekends, with a resourcefulness that came from understanding that the cost of hiring it done was the cost of slowing the next acquisition. They bought a second building in 1981, a third in 1984. Over 40 years of patient, disciplined accumulation, reinvestment, and the specific genius of buying what other people overlooked and holding it long enough for the city to catch up with their judgment, they had built a portfolio of 23 properties. My grandfather had said, in the last year of his life, that the portfolio was for the family. My grandmother had a more specific understanding of what that meant. I need to tell you about the family, because the family is the context without which nothing makes sense. My grandmother had 3 children. My mother, Adiz, was the youngest, the child who had gone to nursing school, worked 30 years in a hospital, bought a modest house in Concord, and lived the specific life of a woman who understood that what she had was enough, and that enough was a dignified and sufficient thing to have. My mother called my grandmother every Sunday and visited every month and was present at every significant occasion and asked nothing of the portfolio except to be told, periodically, that it was well. My mother's older sister, Vivian Oduya Reeves, was the middle child. Vivian was 59. Lived in a large house in Ballantyne that was funded by the combination of her husband Harold's corporate salary and a sequence of real estate transactions over the years in which my grandmother had provided financial assistance that Vivian described as loans and my grandmother described as advances, and my grandfather. In the one conversation about this that I was present for described as a pattern, Vivian's relationship with the portfolio was not one of patient stewardship. It was one of anticipated inheritance. She had been calculating, in the specific way of someone who considers this calculation a reasonable and private activity, what $11 million divided by 3 adult children produced. And she had been doing this calculation for approximately 15 years, and she had formed through the repetition of the calculation a sense of entitlement to that number that had become over time indistinguishable from a fact. My grandmother's oldest child was my Uncle Emeka, who had moved to Atlanta in his 30s and had built a landscaping business that employed 42 people, and that had made him financially comfortable in a way that was genuine and self-created, and that had given him the specific peace of a man who did not need anyone else's money and therefore did not spend time thinking about it. Then there was the grandchildren generation. Vivian had 2 children, Marcus 32, who worked in sales at a tech company and drove a car that was slightly more expensive than his income should have supported, and who had inherited from his mother the specific orientation toward the portfolio that treated its eventual distribution as a financial planning element rather than a future gift. Marcus's sister, Portia, 29, who was in graduate school studying something that changed depending on who she was talking to, and whose relationship with money was characterized primarily by the absence of her own. My Uncle Emeka had 3 children who were pleasant, employed, and largely uninvested in what happened to the portfolio because their father had raised them to understand that other people's money was other people's business. I was my mother's only child. My relationship with my grandmother was the most important relationship of my adult life. Not because of the portfolio. I want to be precise about this, because what I am about to tell you involves money, and it would be easy to read it as a story about money, and it is not. It is a story about a woman who built something real and had the right to decide what to do with it, and about the people who believed that her right to decide was subordinate to their expectation of receiving. My grandmother and I spoke 4 times a week. Not because I was managing her or monitoring her, but because she was interesting, and because she remembered everything, and because she had a habit of reading the Charlotte Observer every morning, and calling me to discuss it that had started when I was in pharmacy school and had continued without interruption for 12 years. She was sharp, she was funny. She had opinions about commercial real estate trends that were more accurate than most things I read in professional publications, because she had been operating in the Charlotte market for 50 years and understood its logic in a way that required no formal credential to be genuine expertise. She had also, in the 2 years before the dining room incident, been telling me something that I had been listening to carefully and that I understood was important. She had been telling me that she had decided what to do with the portfolio, not in one conversation. In the accumulating way of someone who was thinking through a significant decision and needed to think it through out loud in the company of someone she trusted. Over many phone calls and Sunday visits, and one long afternoon in the spring when we had sat on her back porch with sweet tea, and she had walked me through the entire portfolio building, by building neighborhood by neighborhood. With the memory and the affection of a woman describing a life's work, she had said, "I built this for a reason. The reason was not to divide it into thirds and watch it disappear in 15 years. I had said, "What's the reason?" She had said, "The reason is that money that has been built carefully should be used carefully. It should produce something. It should go to the hands that will use it to build rather than the hands that will use it to spend." I had said, "What does that mean specifically, Grandma?" She had said, "It means I've been talking to Preston Harwell, the estate attorney, who had been my grandmother's attorney since 2003 and who she trusted with the specific trust that comes from 20 years of professional relationship and demonstrated integrity. She had been revising her estate plan. She had not told Vivian. She had not told Marcus or Portia. She had told my Uncle Emeka, because Emeka was the kind of person who could receive information about an estate plan without trying to influence it, and because she needed someone else in the family to know. She had told me, gradually, in the accumulating way of our phone calls. What she had decided was not, as I came to understand it over many conversations, an act of punishment or favoritism. It was the act of a woman who had built something with a specific philosophy, that capital should compound, that assets should be stewarded. That the people best positioned to continue building were the people who had demonstrated they knew how, and who wanted her estate plan to reflect that philosophy rather than the simple arithmetic of equal division. The plan, as Preston Harwell had developed it, established a family trust that would hold the portfolio for 20 years under the management of a professional trustee with specific distribution provisions. Emeka's children would receive modest annual distributions as beneficiaries in recognition of their father's independent success and their demonstrated financial responsibility. My mother would receive a guaranteed income stream from the portfolio for the remainder of her life in recognition of her years of care and presence. My two independent pharmacies would receive a significant capital infusion, structured as a trust investment, not a gift, in recognition of the business I had built and the potential my grandmother believed it represented. The portfolio itself would remain intact rather than being sold or divided. Vivian and her children would receive distributions from the trust at standard intervals, but they would not receive the lump sum inheritance that Vivian had been calculating for 15 years. The architecture of the plan reflected my grandmother's assessment, formed over 81 years of watching people, that some members of her family had demonstrated they would build with resources, and some had demonstrated they would consume them. My grandmother had the right to make this decision. She had built the portfolio. She had earned the right to decide what to do with it. She had told Preston to prepare the documents. She had not told Vivian. The dining room meeting was my grandmother's idea in a form she had discussed with Preston. She wanted to tell the family herself, in person, before the documents were finalized. She did not want them to find out from attorneys after her death with no opportunity for the kind of conversation that might, over time, produce understanding if not agreement. She had said, "I am not doing this to punish Vivian. I am doing it because it is right. But I want to tell her myself. I owe her that." The meeting was on a Saturday in September at my grandmother's house. My grandmother's house was the original house she and my grandfather had bought in 1981. A 4-bedroom brick colonial in the Dilworth neighborhood that had been renovated 3 times, and that was surrounded by the specific trees of a house that has been on a property long enough for the plantings to become significant. It was a beautiful house. It felt like someone had lived in it. Present, my grandmother, Preston Harwell, my mother Adiz, Vivian and Marcus and Portia, Uncle Emeka by phone from Atlanta, and me. Notably absent, Harold, Vivian's husband, who had not been invited because my grandmother had decided this was a family conversation, and Harold had been peripheral to the family's financial history in ways that made his presence more complicated than useful. My grandmother sat at the head of the table. Preston sat to her right with his briefcase. The rest of us were arranged around the table in the configuration that families take at significant events, not random, but carrying the specific weight of who sat where. My grandmother spoke first. She said, "I've asked you all here because I want to tell you something important while I am alive and present and can speak for myself. I have been working with Preston on my estate plan, and I have made decisions that some of you will not find easy to hear." Vivian said, "Mama." My grandmother said, "Let me finish." Vivian was quiet. My grandmother spoke for approximately 20 minutes. She described the portfolio, its history, its current value, the 40 years of work it represented. She described her philosophy about what should happen to it. She described the trust structure Preston had developed and its provisions. She was specific and clear and honest in the way she had always been specific and clear and honest, because my grandmother considered vagueness a form of disrespect to the people you were speaking to. The room was quiet through most of it. My mother was still. Uncle Emeka's voice on the phone was still. I was still. Vivian was not still. Her face had been changing through my grandmother's explanation in the specific way that faces change when they are receiving information that conflicts with a certainty they have held for a long time. First, disbelief, which manifested as the particular expression of someone waiting for the part where the confusion gets resolved. Then comprehension, which arrived in her jaw and her hands. Then something that was not grief and was not anger but was the combination of both that produces, in certain people, action rather than feeling. When my grandmother finished, Preston opened his briefcase. He said, "Miriam, I have the trust documents ready for your signature when you're ready to proceed. I also have a document I'd like to distribute to each family member that summarizes the trust provisions in plain language." He distributed the summary documents. He also, as he had discussed with my grandmother in advance, removed an envelope from his briefcase. He said, "This is a letter of instruction accompanying a check made payable to Celeste Oduya Warren's pharmacy operating account per the trust's initial funding provision. Miriam wanted this executed today." He placed the envelope on the table. My grandmother said, "The check is for $5 million. The room was silent for a different reason than before. Marcus inhaled audibly. Portia's hand went to her mouth. Vivian looked at the envelope. She looked at my grandmother. She looked at me. She said, "You're giving her $5 million. My grandmother said, "The trust is investing $5 million in Celeste's pharmacy business. It's a trust investment, not a personal gift. The terms are in the document." Vivian said, "And what are we getting?" My grandmother said, "The trust distributions are detailed in the summary document in front of you." Vivian picked up the summary document. She read for approximately 45 seconds. I watched her face. She set it down. She said, "This is not equal." My grandmother said, "It was never intended to be equal. It was intended to be right." Vivian said, "You're punishing me." My grandmother said, "I'm making decisions about assets I built. That's not punishment. That's my right." Vivian said, "You built them for the family." My grandmother said, "I built them to build something. What I'm doing now continues the building." Vivian said, "Celeste already has 2 pharmacies. She doesn't need $5 million. My grandmother said, "The 2 pharmacies are why she gets the investment. She's proven she knows how to use it." Vivian said, "And I haven't." My grandmother said, "Vivian, I love you. I have always loved you. And I know what you've been expecting for 15 years. I know because I'm your mother and I pay attention. But what you've been expecting is not what I'm going to do. I'm sorry for the pain that causes. I'm not sorry for the decision." The silence lasted approximately 8 seconds. Then Vivian reached across the table and picked up the envelope. I said, "Aunt Vivian." She tore it in half. Marcus reached forward and tore the halves into quarters. Portia stacked the pieces. Vivian pushed them toward me. She said, "There. Problem solved." I looked at the pieces of paper. I looked at Preston Harwell. Preston was looking at his briefcase. "Here is what I want you to understand about what happened next, because this is the part that determines everything." Preston Harwell had practiced estate law for 38 years. He had sat at tables where wills were contested, and families disintegrated, and people said and did things in the presence of grief and money that revealed exactly who they were. He had seen, in those 38 years, some things. He had not seen this specific thing before. But he had prepared for it. My grandmother had told him, in their preparatory conversation, that she wanted to be certain the check distribution was legally secure regardless of what happened in the room. She had said, "I know my daughter. I love her, but I know her. Preston, make sure the important documents are protected." Preston had prepared accordingly. What Vivian tore in half was the copy. The original check, signed by my grandmother and drawn on the trust's funding account, which had been established at First Carolina Bank 3 weeks earlier, was inside a second envelope in Preston's briefcase. That envelope was already addressed to First Carolina Bank's main Charlotte branch, to the attention of the trust department manager, and contained both the original check and the trust's executed funding instructions. Preston had sealed that envelope before the meeting. He had already arranged for a courier to pick it up from his office at 3 o'clock that afternoon. It was currently 1:47. I want to tell you what Preston said after Vivian pushed the torn pieces across the table, because what he said was the thing that changed the temperature of the room. He said, "Mrs. Reeves, what you've destroyed is a copy of the check. The original was processed through the trust funding mechanism this morning. The bank has been notified of the trust's establishment and the funding provisions. The distribution to Ms. Oduya-Warren's pharmacy account will be processed per the trust instructions regardless of what happens to any physical documents in this room." Vivian said, "What?" Preston said, "The trust is a legal entity separate from any physical documents. Your mother signed the trust documents last week. The check was executed this morning and the bank was notified. Destroying a copy of the check has no legal effect on the transaction." Vivian turned to my grandmother. She said, "You already signed everything." My grandmother said, "I signed everything last Tuesday." She said, "This meeting was," my grandmother said, "I wanted to tell you myself. I wanted to give you the chance to hear it from me rather than from attorneys after I'm gone." Vivian said, "This was already done." My grandmother said, "Yes." The room was very quiet. Marcus said, "Can we contest it?" Preston said, in the specific patient tone of an attorney who has answered this question many times, "The trust has been properly executed under North Carolina law. Your grandmother was of sound mind and body at the time of execution, as documented by her physician's certification that is part of the trust record. There is no legal basis for a successful contest." Marcus said, "She could have been pressured." Preston said, "By whom?" Marcus looked at me. I said, "I was not present at any of the document executions. I was at my pharmacy." Preston said, "I can confirm that Ms. Oduya-Warren was not present at any stage of the trust drafting or execution. The trust reflects your grandmother's independent decisions." Portia started to cry. Not the kind of crying that is genuine grief, the kind that arrives when a financial expectation collapses. Vivian sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mama, I have been planning around this money for 15 years. My grandmother said, "I know." Vivian said, "Harold and I made decisions." My grandmother said, "I know." Vivian said, "You should have told me." My grandmother said, "I'm telling you now." Vivian said, "Now is too late to change what we did." My grandmother said, "I'm sorry for that." "I'm not sorry for the decision." The meeting concluded 20 minutes later, without warmth and without resolution. Vivian left without saying goodbye to my grandmother. Marcus followed. Portia paused at the door and looked back at my grandmother and then looked away and went with her mother. My grandmother sat at the head of the table and watched the door close. I went to her. She said, "Well." I said, "Well." She said, "Preston, did we do everything correctly?" Preston said, "Everything is properly executed and the bank will receive the funding package this afternoon." She said, "Good." She said, "Celeste." I said, "Yes, Grandma." She said, "Use it well." I said, "I will." She said, "I know, that's why." She reached over and squeezed my hand. She was 81 years old and she had built $11 million from 17. And she had just sat at her own dining room table and watched her daughter tear up a copy of a check, and she was the calmest person in the room. I thought, that is who I want to be. Before we get to what happened next, and what happened next was significant in ways I could not have predicted, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone believed that destroying a document could destroy what the document represented? Where the performance of power was mistaken for the exercise of it? Tell me in the comments, because the next 72 hours are about exactly that mistake. Subscribe and stay close, because the bank manager's call is coming, and it changes everything. The 72 hours after the meeting were the most complicated of my professional and personal life simultaneously, which is a specific kind of demanding that I do not recommend. Professionally, I needed to prepare my pharmacy operations for a $5 million trust investment, which meant engaging my own attorney reviewing the trust's investment terms with a financial advisor I trusted, and beginning the due diligence process for the expansion I had been planning for 2 years and had not had the capital to execute. Personally, I needed to be present for my grandmother, who was 81, and had just conducted the most emotionally demanding conversation of her recent life. And for my mother, who was navigating the specific difficulty of being the sibling of someone who had just received news that had caused her to leave without saying goodbye to their mother. And in the background of both of those things, the phone that had been ringing. Vivian called my mother 4 times in the 24 hours after the meeting. My mother told me this not to generate sympathy, but because she believed in keeping me informed, and because the content of the calls was relevant to what was developing. The calls had a consistent theme. The trust was wrong, the decision was unfair, there must be a legal avenue, and my mother needed to understand that if she did not stand with Vivian in challenging the trust, it would damage the relationship between them permanently. My mother's response across 4 calls was consistent and gentle and unambiguous. She supported my grandmother's right to make decisions about her own estate, and she would not join a challenge. Vivian said on the 4th call that my mother had always been the one who supported Celeste over family. My mother said, "I support your mother's decisions, Vivian. That's different." Marcus had, in the 24 hours after the meeting, retained an attorney. I know this because Preston Harwell called me on Sunday morning approximately 36 hours after the meeting to tell me that he had received a letter from an attorney representing Marcus and Vivian O'Dwyer-Reeves, claiming that the trust had been executed under circumstances of undue influence and requesting that the trust be suspended pending investigation. Preston said, "This is a standard response to estate decisions that disappoint beneficiaries. It is not a viable claim, but it is a process that must be responded to." I said, "How long does the response process take?" He said, "We will file our response within 10 days. The claim has no merit. The documentation supporting your grandmother's independent decision-making is comprehensive. The physician certification, the independent witnesses at execution, my own notes from 3 years of estate planning conversations. A court will not sustain an undue influence claim on these facts." I said, "And the trust distribution?" He said, "The trust has been properly funded. The bank received the documents yesterday afternoon as planned. The distribution to your pharmacy account will process on Tuesday per the trust's funding instructions." I said, "So the check?" He said, "The check your aunt destroyed was a copy, as I explained at the meeting. It had no legal significance. The transaction was already completed." I said, "Preston, do they know this? That the transaction is already done?" He said, "Their attorney knows. They've had the trust documents since yesterday. I sent copies as required." I said, "And the bank call?" He said, "I want to tell you about something that happened yesterday afternoon that I believe you should be aware of." He told me. After the courier had delivered the trust documents to First Carolina Bank's trust department, the bank's trust manager, a woman named Diane Cavallo, who had been managing trust accounts at First Carolina for 22 years, had reviewed the funding package. Standard procedure for a new trust account. She had also, because the trust package included a family beneficiary summary and the account was flagged for significant funding, performed the bank's standard due diligence on all named parties. In the course of that due diligence, she had identified something. Marcus O'Dwyer-Reeves had an account at First Carolina Bank. A personal checking account that had been open for 9 years. The account was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was a series of transactions in that account over the previous 18 months that, in the context of the trust document she had just reviewed, Diane Cavallo had flagged for review. The transactions showed a pattern of transfers from an account she could identify as connected to my grandmother's personal banking, transfers that totaled, over 18 months, approximately $420,000, into Marcus's personal checking account. These transfers had no documentation in the trust file. They had not been disclosed in the estate planning conversations. They were not characterized in any document as advances or loans or planned distributions. They appeared, based on the preliminary review, to be unauthorized. Diane Cavallo had, per the bank's standard protocol, placed a hold on the review and notified the bank's compliance department. The compliance department had, on Sunday morning. Approximately the same time Preston was calling me, notified my grandmother. Preston said, Miriam received a call from First Carolina's compliance department at 10 o'clock this morning. They informed her of the transactions and asked her to come to the branch for a meeting. I said, she didn't know about the transfers. Preston said, she did not know about the transfers. I said, Marcus had been taking money from her account. Preston said, I cannot make that characterization yet. What I can tell you is that your grandmother did not authorize those transfers as far as she recalls, and that the bank's compliance department is treating the situation as requiring investigation. I said, Preston, what does this mean for Vivian and Marcus's legal claim? Preston was quiet for a moment. He said, Celeste, I want to be careful about what I say here because the investigation is in its early stages. But I will tell you this. If the compliance department's investigation substantiates the preliminary finding, the legal and financial consequences for Marcus would be significant. And the credibility of a legal claim alleging undue influence by someone else becomes considerably more complicated when the claimant is himself under investigation for financial impropriety related to the same estate. I said, they filed the undue influence claim. He said, yes. I said, and now Marcus is under investigation for potentially stealing from my grandmother. He said, the investigation is in its early stages. I said, Preston. He said, yes. I said, that is what is happening. He said, that is what appears to be happening. I sat in my apartment kitchen for a long time after that call. I thought about Vivian tearing the envelope in half with both hands while looking at me. I thought about Marcus stacking the pieces. I thought about the neat pile they had made of what they believed was the destruction of something, and how the destruction had already been irrelevant before it happened, and how the pile of torn paper had not been the most significant document-related event of that afternoon. I called my grandmother. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. She said, Celeste. I said, Preston told me. She said, they called me at 10. I said, how are you? She said, I am angry and I am sad and I am not surprised, which is the worst part. Not being surprised. I said, Grandma, she said, he was in my house. He had keys to my house. He drove me to my appointments. He had access to my account because I trusted him. She stopped. She said, he had access because I trusted him. I said, yes. She said, do you know what the hardest part is? I said, what? She said, I would have given him money if he asked. He knew that. He didn't have to take it. He could have asked. I sat with that. She said, that's the part that makes me sad, not the money, the fact that he could have asked. I said, I know. She said, what happens now? I said, the bank investigates. Preston responds to the legal claim. The trust stands because it was properly executed. The distribution processes on Tuesday. She said, and Vivian? I said, I don't know yet. That depends on what she knew and when she knew it. She said, do you think she knew? I thought about this carefully. I said, I think she knew something. I don't think she knew specifically. I think she knew enough to not ask questions. My grandmother was quiet for a moment. She said, that's about right. She said, Celeste. I said, yes. She said, the money is protected. I said, the trust is properly funded. Preston confirmed it this morning. The distribution process is Tuesday. She said, good. Then the important thing is done. She said, now we let the rest play out. She said it the way she said everything important, with the specific calm of a woman who had built $11 million from 17, and understood that the most powerful position in any situation was the one you arrived at through patience and correct action, rather than the one you seized through force. She said, I'm going to the bank tomorrow morning. Will you come with me? I said, of course. She said, and Preston will be there. I said, I'll call him tonight. She said, good. She said, I love you, sweetheart. I said, I love you, Grandma. She said, use the money well. I said, I will. The meeting at First Carolina Bank took place on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. My grandmother, Preston Harwell, and I were in Diane Cavallo's office on the third floor of the main Charlotte branch. Diane Cavallo was 54, with the specific composure of someone who had spent 22 years managing the complicated intersection of families and money, and had developed a professional equanimity that was genuine rather than performed. She showed my grandmother the transaction records, 18 months of transfers, 7 separate transactions ranging from $30,000 to $90,000 each, all initiated through the bank's online transfer system from my grandmother's personal account, all deposited into an account registered to Marcus Allen Reeves. My grandmother looked at each transaction date and amount with the expression of a woman doing a very specific and painful accounting. She said, "I did not authorize these." Diane said, "We understand." The bank's compliance team has confirmed that these transactions were not consistent with your historical transfer patterns and were initiated from a device not associated with your regular banking. Preston said, "From whose device?" Diane said, "Our technology team's preliminary assessment indicates the transfers were initiated from a mobile device registered to Marcus Allen Reeves. The room was very quiet." Preston said, "I'll need a copy of that preliminary assessment for the estate record." Diane said, "We'll provide the necessary documentation through the appropriate legal channels." My grandmother said, "What happens now?" Diane said, "The bank has already filed a suspicious activity report with the relevant authorities, which is standard protocol in these circumstances. We've also placed a hold on the account receiving the funds pending the investigation." Preston said, "And the trust distribution?" Diane said, "The trust account is entirely separate from the accounts under investigation and will not be affected. The distribution to Ms. Oduya Warren's pharmacy account will process this afternoon." My grandmother said, "Good." She said it the same way she had said it the night before on the phone. "Good. The important thing is done." I drove my grandmother home after the bank meeting. She was quiet in the car. Not the silence of grief or anger, but the silence of someone who has completed a significant task and is resting before the next one. She said, as I pulled into her driveway, "Do you want to come in?" I said, "For a while." We sat on her back porch with sweet tea. The October air in Charlotte was the specific perfect temperature of early fall in the Carolinas, the kind of air that makes you aware of being alive without demanding any particular response to that awareness. She said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "When I started this process with Preston 2 years ago, the hardest part was not deciding what to do. The hardest part was accepting that deciding what to do meant accepting what I knew about the people the decision would affect." I said, "What did you know?" She said, "I knew that Marcus had been borrowing money from me informally for 3 years. Small amounts at first. 20 here, 30 there, always with a story, always with a repayment promise. I should have stopped it earlier. I didn't because he was family, and I told myself family deserved patience." I said, "You didn't know about the account transfers." She said, "I didn't know about the account transfers. But I knew enough to know that he had a relationship with money that was not healthy and that giving him a large inheritance would not help that relationship." She said, "And I knew about Vivian, not specifically, but in the pattern. She has been spending toward an expectation for 15 years. A large inheritance for Vivian is not a gift. It's the settlement of a debt she believes she's owed." I said, "And you couldn't let the estate settle a debt that was never owed." She said, "No, I could not." She said, "Celeste, I want to tell you why specifically I made the decision I made about your pharmacies." I said, "You don't have to," she said. "I want to. Because I need you to understand it wasn't because you're my favorite or because I love you more. I have grandchildren in Atlanta who I love deeply and who I provided for differently." I said, "I understand." She said, "I invested in your pharmacies because I watched you build them and I saw myself. Not because you remind me of myself. You're different from me in many ways. But because I recognized the specific thing that I had when I was building, which is the understanding that money is a tool, and that a tool is only useful in the hands of someone who knows what they're building." She said, "You know what you're building. I've watched you build it. I've watched you make the right decisions and the hard decisions and the boring decisions that don't feel significant until 20 years later when you can see the compound effect." She said, "That's why." I said, Thank you for telling me specifically. She said, I wanted you to know. I wanted you to understand that it was a professional judgment, not a personal preference. I said, it was both. She said, yes, it was both. We sat on the porch until the afternoon light changed, and then I made dinner from the things in her refrigerator, which I knew as well as my own. And we ate at her kitchen table, and she told me 3 stories about properties she and my grandfather had purchased in the 80s that I had heard before and that I was glad to hear again. What happened in the 2 weeks after the bank meeting unfolded in the way that legal and financial processes unfold. Not dramatically, not in single revelatory moments, but in accumulated actions and responses and consequences that built toward an outcome that was when it arrived. Not a surprise, but still significant. The bank's investigation proceeded. The suspicious activity report that Diane Cavallo's compliance department had filed triggered a review by the relevant authorities. The preliminary technology evidence, the transfers initiated from Marcus's registered device, was substantive. Marcus retained a criminal defense attorney. Marcus's attorney withdrew the undue influence claim on the trust within 5 days of the bank's notification to all parties. The withdrawal was strategic. Pressing a legal claim while simultaneously under investigation for financial crimes against the same estate was not a viable position. Preston received the withdrawal notification on a Thursday and called me to confirm it. He said, "The claim has been withdrawn." I said, "And the trust?" He said, "The trust stands. The distribution processed as planned. Your pharmacy account received the $5 million transfer last Tuesday." I said, "I know." "I saw it," he said. "How are you feeling about the expansion?" I said, "Ready." The truth was more complicated than ready, which is always the case with $5 million. I had spent the week after the distribution in a series of meetings with my financial advisor, my pharmacy operations consultant, and 2 commercial real estate brokers I had worked with over the years. The pharmacies were healthy. Both locations were profitable, both had strong patient relationships. Both had the specific community presence that independent pharmacies build when they are run by someone who understands that the relationship between a pharmacist and a patient is a different kind of relationship than what a chain provides. The expansion I had been planning for 2 years involved a 3rd location in a neighborhood that was underserved in exactly the ways my 2 existing locations had addressed underservice in their neighborhoods, plus a significant investment in the technology infrastructure that independent pharmacy was going to need to compete effectively in the next decade. $5 million made the plan viable rather than aspirational. I signed the letter of intent for the 3rd location on a Friday afternoon in the office of the commercial real estate broker who had found the property, and I sat for a moment after signing and thought about my grandmother saying, "Use it well." I called her immediately. She answered on the 2nd ring. I said, "I signed the letter of intent." She said, "Where is it?" I told her. She said, "I know that neighborhood. I looked at a property there in 1994. We weren't ready then." I said, "We're ready now." She said, "Yes, you are." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like someone who has been given exactly the right tool at exactly the right time." She said, "That was the intention." She said, "Celeste." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." I said, "I know." She said, "He would have wanted to see the building." I said, "When we open, you and I are going to walk through it together before anyone else does." She said, "I would like that very much." She said, "Now go do the work." I went to do the work. Vivian's situation in the 2 weeks after the meeting was something I received through my mother, rather than directly. And I want to be clear about the distance I maintained from it, not out of indifference, but out of the specific understanding that the consequences of what Vivian and Marcus had done were theirs to navigate, and that my involvement in their navigation would not help anyone. What my mother told me, in the specific factual way my mother conveyed information, was as follows. Marcus was facing a formal investigation into the unauthorized transfers. The amount, $420,000, was not small. His attorney was managing the process, but the preliminary evidence was substantial. The consequences would depend on the investigation's findings and the subsequent legal process, but the range of possible outcomes included significant criminal liability. Vivian's role was more complicated. The investigation had not found evidence that she had directly participated in the unauthorized transfers. What it had found, through the review of communications that the bank's investigation had made available, was that Marcus had discussed the transfers with his mother in general terms. Not the mechanism, but the fact of accessing money from my grandmother that she was not formally providing. Vivian's responses in those communications had not been objecting ones. Whether not objecting constituted legal liability was something that attorneys were working through. Whether it constituted something else, a failure of a different kind. The specific failure of a parent who allowed a child to do something wrong because the wrong served a financial interest she shared, was something that was not being worked through by attorneys, and that was, I suspected, the harder thing to resolve. My grandmother did not speak to Vivian for 3 weeks after the meeting. Not from anger. My grandmother was not a woman whose primary response to difficulty was anger, but from the specific need for space that comes when someone you love has done something that requires you to update your understanding of them in ways that take time. Vivian called her 4 times in those 3 weeks. My grandmother listened to the voicemails and did not return them. On the 22nd day, she did. I was not present for that call. My grandmother told me about it afterward. She said, I called her. I said, how was it? She said it was what it was. She was sorry. Whether she was sorry for what happened or sorry for what it had cost, I couldn't fully tell. Maybe both. Maybe in time more of one and less of the other. I said, what did you say? She said I loved her and that I was not going to spend whatever time I have left not speaking to my daughter. And I said that the trust decisions were final and that I would not be revisiting them. And I said that what Marcus had done was not something I could address between the two of us. The legal process would address it. I said, how did she take that? She said, quietly. She took it quietly, which is not how Vivian usually takes things. I think the last 3 weeks have taught her something. I said, do you think it's enough? She said, I think the learning is beginning. Whether it becomes enough is a longer question. She said, Celeste. I said, yes. She said, you asked if I thought Vivian knew about the transfers. I said, I remember. She said, I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. My honest assessment is that she knew something was happening and chose to understand it as Marcus being resourceful rather than Marcus taking something he hadn't been given. That's a choice. Not the same choice as initiating the transfers, but a choice. I said, yes. She said, that choice is between her and God, and whatever she's going to spend the rest of her life making peace with. My job is to decide how to move forward with my daughter, and moving forward means being honest about what I know and still choosing to be in relationship. I said, that's generous. She said, it's not generosity, it's age. When you're 81, you understand that the alternative to hard relationships is no relationships, and no relationships is not preferable just because it's simpler. She said, I've earned the right to complicated. I said, yes, you have. She said, so have you. I said, I haven't done anything complicated. She said, you've watched your family go through something significant and you've managed to remain both honest and kind throughout. That's more complicated than people think. I said, I learned from you. She said, you learned from watching me. There's a difference. What you do with what you watch is yours. I thought about that for a long time. The 3rd pharmacy location is currently under construction. The contractor broke ground 6 weeks ago. I have been on site every Saturday morning for 6 weeks, which is the kind of Saturday presence that my grandmother would recognize from the decades of her own Saturday mornings in properties that were being built into something. My pharmacy operations consultant has been managing the transition plan for the existing 2 locations to prepare for the additional operational complexity of a 3rd site. We're adding 4 staff members across the existing locations in advance of the opening, including a pharmacy technician whose hiring I am particularly glad about. She is 24, recently certified, and has the specific combination of precision and patient-facing warmth that independent pharmacy requires, and that is not as common as it should be. The technology infrastructure investment is underway. A systems integrator I have been working with for 3 months is building the interoperability platform that will allow the 3 locations to function as a coordinated system rather than 3 separate operations, which is the piece that will determine whether the 3rd location produces returns at the scale the trust investment projected. I think about my grandmother's money every time I am on the construction site. Not in a heavy way, not with the weight of obligation that could make it difficult to work freely. In a light way, the way you think about someone who is watching and wishes you well. Her $11 million built itself from 17 in 55 years because she made the right decisions at the right times with the right discipline. The $5 million that came to me is not going to build itself. I have to do that work. But it arrived in the right hands at the right time because she knew what she was looking at. That is the gift, not the amount. The confidence that she looked at what I had built and what I was building and made a professional judgment that said, this continues. Marcus's legal situation resolved in the way that legal situations resolve when the evidence is substantial and the defense has limited options. I am not going to detail the specific terms because they involve legal proceedings that have privacy components, but the resolution involved accountability of a kind that was appropriate to what had been done. Vivian's relationship with my grandmother has been rebuilding slowly and imperfectly, which is the only honest characterization available. They have dinner together once a month now. My mother tells me these dinners are real rather than performed, that my grandmother and Vivian are finding a way to be in honest relationship that does not require pretending that what happened did not happen. I believe this is possible, and I believe my grandmother is the right person to make it so. She has always been the right person in the room. My mother asked me recently what I thought the whole experience had taught me. I said that a document is not the thing it represents. The check Aunt Vivian tore up was paper. What the paper represented was already in motion. You can destroy a piece of paper and not touch what it stood for. My mother said. Your grandmother said something similar. I said, what did she say? My mother said. She said you can tear up a copy, but you can't undo a decision that was correctly made. The correctly made decision is the durable thing. Everything else is presentation. I said, that sounds exactly like her. My mother said, she also said something about you. I said, what? My mother said, she said. Celeste understands that the work is the proof. She always has. That's why I wasn't worried. I have thought about that sentence every day since my mother told me. She wasn't worried. After 81 years of building and watching, and understanding what people do with resources when you give them the chance, she had looked at my 2 pharmacies and my 12 years of correct decisions and my specific stubbornness about owning what I built, and she had not worried. That is the gift worth more than the $5 million. That is the thing I will carry into every Saturday morning on every construction site for the rest of my professional life. My name is Celeste Oduya Warren. I am 36 years old. I own 3 pharmacy locations. My grandmother built $11 million from 17. I am not going to let her be wrong about me. That is the whole story. Not the check, not the torn paper, not the bank call. The whole story is a woman who built something real and a granddaughter who understood why, and the specific decision to put the tool in the right hands at the right time. The tool is in the right hands. The work is underway. That is enough. That is everything. If you have ever watched someone you love make a decision that required them to choose truth over peace, this story is for you. The correctly made decision is the durable thing. Subscribe and stay. Next week, I have a story about a woman who waited 40 years for the right moment to show her family what she had built, and the moment arrived at someone else's retirement party.